So let me know if you can see my screen now. Yeah. So starting with the firepower threat defense HA. Before that, I'd like to introduce myself. So I've been working with Cisco for around 2.5 years. Before that, I was working with Juniper TAC. I have total around 4.5 years of experience with firewall products. So yeah, so let's get started. So this is the agenda for today's discussion. I'll be taking you through the introduction to FTD, and then why do we need FTD-HA, the reasons, and what is the licensing, how does it work. I have made certain videos for you to understand the creation of FTD-HA, the break, delete, and the switch options. And in the end, we'll show you what logs can we look into when you have certain issues with regards to the FTD-HA. So this is going to be fully focused on FTD and the HA operations involved in it. So I'd like to begin with um, telling you how an overview of the architecture of the FTD, how it works, how is it different from the ASA. So on the PPT, you could on the slide you can see there is a diagram which yeah. So refer to the first diagram that I'm talking about. So that's a big picture. That's the overall understanding of how we have integrated the SNOT and the ASA together to come up with a new firewall, which is firepower threat defense. So basically, we have two parts to this: the ASA engine and the SNOT engine. The other names for ASA engine, we will refer it as Lena in the upcoming slide. So I can use ASA engine and Lena interchangeably. I can use SNOT and firepower interchangeably. So these are terminologies. Other terminologies that we'll be using here will be FMC, Firepower Management Center, and FTD for the firepower threat defense. So for an overview, traffic would enter the ASA engine. We would do certain pre-checks on the ASA, and on the basis of certain configuration called as pre-filter rules, we'll decide if this traffic is to be sent to the SNOT or not. If it is to be sent to the SNOT, it will be sent to the SNOT. We have a shared memory over between ASA and SNOT, wherein the packet will be pulled by the SNOT and they will take it through certain policy evaluations. You can refer to the second diagram. We have SI, SSL decryption, access policy, file amp, and SNOT rules. So all this will be happening internally in the SNOT. So when I talk about failover and synchronization of states between FTDs, I'm referring to synchronization of both the SNOT and the ASA part. So unlike ASA failover, so originally, before this, the evolution was that we would be using ASA with firepower modules, and firepower modules did not have any firepower modules did not have any synchronization between amongst themselves. So this is our attempt to create an absolute perfect failover scenario. So traffic would be entering the ASA engine, which is also called as Lena, sent to the SNOT depending on the pre-filter policy. If the pre-filter policy is configured as analyze, it will be sent to SNOT. If it is configured as fast path, the SNOT will be bypassed and it will be sent to out through ASA engine. So this is the flow of packet through the FTD. So let's go to the next slide. So I'll be starting with an overview of what we have on the FTD. So this is like in the FTD, we support active standby only. There is no active because active is a feature which requires multiple context firewalls, and as of now, FTD does not support multiple context. We'll be we can only configure stateful failover because we need to have a state link in FTD as compared to the ASA, wherein we had an option to use a state link, but it was not necessary. but in this case we have to have a state link is required for perfect synchronization across the FTDs. Uh, so the all the policies and the synchronizations will happen from active to the standby unit. Moreover, we unlike ASs, we have a management interface which IP whose IP does not change on failover. So it's somewhat like a console connection wherein it won't be affected on failover if the management interface is all right. Yeah, and considering the FMC's view, all the policies will be pushed to the FTD via the FMC active to the active unit only, and it's the job of the active unit to synchronize it across to the standby unit. Now we have a few platforms that were recently introduced, which are called SSP platforms. One of those is 9300, the other is 4100, and so on. So in 9300 we can only have failover in inter chassis. You can't have a failover between two FTD applications installed on the same hardware on the same chassis. So you need to have them on different chassis. Also, while deploying an application on the 9300, you get an option to deploy it as standalone or in cluster. So you need to have this application deployed in standalone mode only. If you have it in cluster, and then we cannot have failover configured. Also when we deploy an application on the 9300, we do get an option to we will have to assign certain interfaces to 9300. I can show you that. So this is our 9300 box. So let me see if we have an FTD. So this is an 9300 from our lab, and it will have certain logical devices hosted on it. So it has an FTD, and yeah. So while creating this, we get an option to assign interfaces to an application. So 9300 can have 3 different applications. So in order to have failover between two 9300s having FTDs, it is required that the FTDs have same interface names. So independent of the blade in which they are installed on that 9300, the FTD should have same interface names. So these mapping should be the same. Then the failover will come up. So that was about 9300. So as I've described before, we need to have 2 identical devices in hardware. We'll be having a failover link which is required to synchronize the FSM states and states of failover across the failover link. We can use the same link for state synchronization, but it is better to have another state link. So as a basic thumb rule, all the config synchronization and state synchronizations will be done from the active to the standby. There are certain parameters which decide the health of a particular FTD. Those I've mentioned here, which includes snot status, if it is up or down. What is the disk status? Is it full? Is it so it depends. It decides the health of that particular FTD. Interfaces, if a particular interface is down, then we can mark that particular FTD as failed, and the software status. So when we talk about failover, so there are two things that are that are deciding factors. So first of all, there are roles and the others are states. So primary and secondary are the roles which will uniquely identify a box, and second, active and standby are the states. So when we have so let's say we have a fresh failover and two devices booting up, identical devices booting up together. So in that case, if both the devices come up together, then primary will always be chosen as the active box. Now, also if let's say if the boxes are already up and we enable failover on both the devices simultaneously, in this case as well, primary will be chosen as the active box. With regards to the FMC, FMC will see this as a single box, and it will communicate all the configuration and synchronizations to the active unit only. But obviously, FMC will receive events and reports related to connection and health monitor and stuff from both the from both the FTDs. So it will for configuration purposes, this is a single unit for FMC, but for and it's the job of the active to sync it to the standby. But for other issues such as events, we will have both the FTDs reporting to the FMC. So this is my lab setup. This is what I have created for this particular for this particular session. So I have an FTD installed on my ASA 5545, both the ASA 5545s. So I'm using gig 03 as the interface which is connected back to back for both for failover state link and for failover interface. Gig 00 is used for outside, and gig 01 is used for inside. Now I just using this diagram, I would just like to clarify certain points. So I have configured 5545 as the primary, 5545A as the primary, and 5545B as the secondary. Now despite of consider the failover interface. So failover interface has an IP address 1111 on 5545A and 1112 on 5545B. So these addresses they will always remain on the same boxes. They will not swap during a failover. So we can be sure that this IP will always be on the box. 5545A will always have 1111 and 5545B will always have 1112. Just one moment. Yeah. So now talking about data interfaces, consider outside interface. So 5545A is the primary and 5545B is the secondary. Now when I do a configuration for interface IP addresses, we need an active IP and a standby IP. So that means in my diagram 192.168.76.10 will be retained with the active box. So as I've mentioned before, active is a status and primary is a role. So either a primary or a secondary can be active at a time. So at any given point of time, whichever box is the primary will hold the whichever box is the active will hold the active IP on a particular data interface. Another point to keep in mind is that active IP will always be coupled with interface MAC address of the primary. So irrespective of any box being active, it will source its traffic by using primary interfaces MAC address. So let's say gig 00 has a MAC address AAAA and gig 00 on 5545B has BBBB. So active IP will always source its traffic from MAC address AAAA, and similarly for second standby, it will always source its traffic from BBBBB. So in case of a failover, let's say when secondary is active, secondary will source its traffic from IP 76.10, 192.168.76.10 and MAC address AAAA, which is the physical MAC of gig 00 on primary firewall. I hope this is clear. Because this is required in case a lot of cases wherein replacing certain units and stuff. So let's move on to the next slide. So the here we have listed certain features that are supported on the firewall. I will give you some time to go through it. basically synchronization of firewall features on this slide. NAT tables, TCP UDP connections, NOT connection state, ARP table, ARP inspection, dynamic routing protocols, signaling sessions. All this will be synchronized perfectly across the devices, and the job of the active is to send this information to the standby. So so this slide, I have some important points to discuss. So these features that I've highlighted under NGFW features are features which are on the SNOT slide of the FTD. So in the first slide I talked about SNOT and Lena. So these features are from the Lena side, most of them, and these features are from the SNOT side. So out of this, the important points are to discuss about the app ID, IPS detection state, file malware blocking, and file type detection. So with reference to app ID, consider like certain traffic is coming to firewall, and firewall is yet to decide the application name for that particular traffic. So if before identifying that application, the app ID, if a failover is, if a failover happens, the other unit will not be able to detect the app ID because it has not seen the um, entire traffic, and also across failover we only replicate the verdict. So we only after identifying the application we send certain information to the standby saying that okay, this app is WhatsApp or this is Facebook, and now you can match all the traffic to this particular connection to Facebook. Now the key point is here that we don't replicate internal steps that we take. I mean the internal flow chart or the steps that we are taken in identifying a particular application. So those steps are not synchronized. Only the final output is synchronized to the app ID, to the standby unit. So if in case of app is not identified yet and a failure happens, we might hit a wrong rule or a wrong policy on the standby unit. So the next point is about IPS detection state. So when I talk about IPS detection state, what it actually means is, so let's say a particular traffic is supposed to hit a particular signature, like it's a malware or it's a particular SMP traffic or something like that, SMTP traffic or something like that, and I have not yet seen the regex that I'm going to match against a particular signature in that traffic, and while doing so a failover happens. So the new unit will not be able to completely identify, give you a perfect answer as to okay, this should match with the signature, because the internal steps in the matching of the regex, those are not synchronized across the IPS with regards to the IPS on the FTDs. Now, like coming next to the file malware blocking. If given a file, it could either be normal clean or it could be malicious, or the disposition could be unknown. So the dispositions are unknown, malware, or clean. Now, if there's a particular file that is going to the firewall, and if the current active is not yet decided the disposition of the file, and if there is a failover, then it is quite possible that we will let this file go through, because the new active will not be able to identify the disposition because it has not seen the complete file. Now, so the another feature that is worth discussing is the file type detection. So if the detection is not yet happened before a failover, then the new unit will not be able to detect the file type correctly. Yeah. So other features you can have a look as the normal features, but the NGFW features required explanation. So I'll give you some seconds to go through it.
So after next Tuesday the 14th, if the change happens, which has still got to get approved, like the change is raised, I would approve. So as long as there's no change delay.
So let's move to the next slide.
This month, so just so because November.
So these are a list of unsupported features. I can just have a look. The main point here is that with regards to decryption, will only happen successfully if and only if a particular unit has seen the SSL handshake on that box, and if there is a failover between in between before decryption and after the handshake, the new unit might not be able to identify and decrypt the traffic. That's the key point here. So there are particular guidelines that you need to follow when you are having the LAN failover link and state failover link. So yeah, with regards to the guidelines, they need to be dedicated interfaces, each channel redundant. They need to have IP in the same subnet. LAN link is used for synchronizing interface states, heartbeats, MAC addresses on the while the setup of the failover. So as soon as we enable failover, you will see interfaces MAC addresses being exchanged, the device state is being exchanged over the LAN failover link. The stateful failover link is just for synchronizing the connection states from the active to the standby. Now there are particular, so if you see the diagram on the right hand side starting from top, so these are all possible deployments that you could have. You could have failover link going through a separate switch. You could have failover link going through the same switch as your outside inside interfaces, or you could have failover link connected back to both the FTDs. In my lab, it is connected back to back. Now, one particular topic that we need to talk about here is that failover, FTD failover HA in for transparent mode firewalls. So if everyone remembers, transparent mode firewalls are layer 2 firewalls, and they are supposed to pass all the layer 2 traffic, and they can also pass BPDUs for STP traffic. So let's say if a particular firewall is active and it is passing the BPDUs through it, the standby firewall is not passing BPDU. So for the ports which are connected across the switch on the standby firewall, they will not be receiving any BPDU. So for them, those ports are normal. But as soon as there is a failover, it is possible that the new active will start seeing BPDUs across the new active firewall, and the switch ports might end up going into block state because the STP will detect a topology change. So the workarounds that we do apply in such situations is, first, on the firewall we could just block the BPDUs by applying an access list, and that should do it. But apart from there, you can have a BPDU guard. You can enable port fast feature on the switch. You can increase interface hold time on the firewall. This hold time should be more than the STP convergence time, so that once the STP has resolved itself, if it unblocks the port, we can the failure till that time the failure doesn't happen. So increase hold time more than the STP convergence time, and then you can also decrease the STP timers. So moving to the next slide. Yeah, so this is something I have to show you via my lab. Just a moment. Okay, there's some problem with my lab. So these are the steps that we do to create an HA. I was supposed to show you this via video, some reason. So this is interface IP address for failover link, and I'm using the same interface for both the HA link and state link. Just so let's go back to the PPT. So as discussed before, for any data interface, we'll have an active and a standby IP. Both need to be in the same subnet. The any data interface, both the firewalls will keep on exchanging keep alives on those interfaces, sourcing from both the devices. So if on the active unit, there will be keep alives going out with sourcing from the active IP destined for the standby IP, and from on the standby unit, there will be keep alives going out on sourcing from the standby IP destined for the active IP, and this will use the HA protocol 105 that we also use in ASA failover to keep monitoring those interfaces. Yeah, on failover, this addresses swap. So as I've mentioned before, the addresses move with the status of the box. So whichever box is active will keep the active IP, and whichever box is standby will keep the standby. And it will also start using the primary MAC. Active box will start using the primary MAC, and secondary standby box will use the secondary MAC. One point to talk about is advantage of using virtual MAC addresses in failover. So, so as mentioned before, primary MAC addresses will be used by the active unit, irrespective whichever unit is active. So, what happens in a case wherein the primary device is gone bad? So secondary will be active, and so secondary will be the active unit, and that will be the only unit in failover. So right now we have secondary active and no other unit, and secondary is using source MAC address of the primary box, which is removed from failover. Now we want to introduce a new primary box to the failover, right? So this new box will have different MAC address. So when we try to add this device to failover, secondary will still remain active, but it will have to switch to use the MAC addresses from the new primary. So when it does that, the upstream and the downstream devices will have ARP entries which will resolve to the old MAC addresses. So there is a chance of having a certain traffic outage in such scenario. So we have to go and clear the ARP entries on the upstream and the downstream devices so that these outages are not there. So the best thing to do is use the virtual MAC addresses. So even if any unit fails, we just have to replace the unit, and the device can keep on continuing the virtual MAC addresses. So yeah, that's what is mentioned here. So taking into account the differences. So as I've mentioned before, FTD has a management IP which always remains with the same box. So a primary box will always have a management IP and it will not change irrespective of the failover, irrespective of the state of the box. The management IP will be there on that box. So this is a difference from the ASA, wherein ASA, even if you have a management interface, you need to have an active and the standby IP. So on a failover, the IP swap. So you have to go and reconnect the sessions again on a failover to connect to the new active and to the new standby. Yeah, so that is one thing which is different in FTD and ASA. In FTD, there is a connection between FMC and the active unit and the standby unit. These are called acceptance connections. So what FMC does is it creates a policy bundle and sends it to the active unit, and its job of the active unit to orchestrate the deployment on the standby. While we are configuring the ASA, you just have to enter the CLI on the active, and those CLI commands will be replicated across through the standby unit. Now, so one advantage of having a stable or a consistent management IP on FTD is that during troubleshooting, you don't have to reconnect sessions. So let's say you're troubleshooting something wherein which happens on standby after a failure or something like that. So you need consistent management sessions. So that is available with the help of management IP of the FTD, because it will not swap on a failover. Whereas that is not possible for an ASA. You need to have a console if you have to troubleshoot certain problems which occur on a failover. Yeah, so this table talks about the config updates to both the ASA and the FTDs. So yeah, it's quite self-explanatory. FMC will push the config to the active node, and in the ASA, CLI is used to configure the active node, and the config is synchronized. Also, the active node will take up the job of synchronizing all the config to the standby, and the same happens in the ASA as well. Uh, in case wherein a standby unit is shut down and brought back into HA, FTD active unit will synchronize all of the policies and other states to the active to the standby unit, and yeah, and the same goes for the ASA as well. So these are the platforms that we support HA on. The thumb rule is that they should be identical units with respect to hardware, software, memory, and number of interfaces. There are certain issues with certain platforms, as in ASA 5506, 5508, 5516. They have wireless modules, so the config related to the wireless specific config that is not replicated in the failover. 55, 12, 15, 55, 25, these are NGFWs which as of now have no issue. We have FirePOWER 9300 on which FTDHA is supported after 114. Same goes for FirePOWER 4100. There is full support on VMware, so we can have FTD HA on FTDs deployed on VMware. As of now, we don't have any support on FTD for HA on AWS environment. Yeah, so let's say a particular device is, let's say primary is active and secondary is standby. So there should be a reason for a failover to happen. So what are those triggers? What are those conditions wherein the active role will be given to another unit? So the those things are called triggers, and I've mentioned a few triggers over here. So let's say primary is active and secondary is standby. So if the primary crashes, it will see the FTD, the standby FTD will identify that the other unit is not there on the basis of the monitoring on the interface, and it will make himself active and wait for the other unit to come up. And when the other unit comes up, it will join as the standby in the failover. So yeah, unit reloading or crashing is one scenario wherein you can have a failover. Another thing that you can do is to test a failover is to bring an interface down on one of the interfaces. So if we have let's say secondary is active and primary is standby, so you can shut down a particular interface on the interface on the secondary active to see if the failure happens. So on the basis of the interface policy, so there is the in failover configuration, if you remember from ASA, there is interface policy. So that policy is normally configured for one interface. So if there is at least one link down, then there will be failover. So in this case, if we bring down one link, the failover is triggered. Another condition is wherein the monitoring fails on an interface. So as I've mentioned before, both the units keep on polling, keep on sending keep alives on protocol 105 across on that broadcast segment on from the active to the standby and vice versa. So if in case we don't receive any keep alive for the hold time configured, so there is a poll time and a hold time. So poll time is something is the frequency at which we send the keep alives, and hold time is how many poll times you can manage without receiving a keep alive. So if we don't receive any keep alive until the hold time interval, that timer expires and there's a failover declaring the other unit has failed. So another condition is wherein the snot instances on the FTD are down. So if more than 50% of the snot instances are down on the FTD, then that can trigger a failover with respect to the FTDs. Now there is something called as notification daemon in the FTDs. So this daemon deals with synchronizing configuration communication between the snot and the Lena component of the ASA. So I've mentioned in the first slide that there is a Lena component and there is a snot component. We call Lena as well as the ASA engine as well. So there's a daemon which deals with the communication between these two. So if that daemon is down, so that means there is something wrong with the health of that for that FTD, and we will trigger a failover. Another condition is the root partition available. If it is full up to 97%, then it means that the device is not in a healthy state, and we will initiate a failover. With respect to the 9300 boxes, so 9300 boxes have an OS on which there is an application hosted. So it's like having a mobile phone and Android over which you have an application like a WhatsApp hosted. So when the Android is not able to communicate with the WhatsApp application in the backend, then similarly this is relatable to that. So if the software of the chassis is not able to communicate with the software of the application, so there will be heartbeat failure. In that situations where this communication is failing, we will trigger a failover. So yeah, these are the triggers which will cause failovers. And yeah, let's look into the next slide. So this slide talks about the licensing requirements and how many licenses we use up when we use FTD in HA. So for bringing FTDs in HA, the only requirement is that you should have a base license on both the devices. So if you have base license on each of the FTDs, then you can register them to the same FMC and then add it to an HA. But if you want to go ahead and use certain features which require thread license, malware license, and URL licenses, then you'll need two of those licenses for every feature. So let's say you want to use a thread license, the used count under the FMC will increase to 2, because both the units need to have these licenses, since any one of them can pass traffic at any point of time, and they will need the pulses to be deployed to both the devices. Yeah, so that's the main catch from this PPT, that every feature needs 2 licenses. So yeah, so the next part is with respect to the creation of FTDs. I'll pause here for a minute, just take a break. So yeah, let's get started. So in between, if you have any queries, you can post it in the Q&A section, and we'll be answering those questions as well. Now let's go to the prerequisites. So you need to have 2 FTDs registered to an FMC with same hardware, same software, same number of interfaces. The main point here is that there should be no deployment pending on any of the FTDs, otherwise we will not be able to create an HA. It will throw an error saying that there is a deployment pending on one of the peers, and you might have to resolve that first and then do it. So I had the same problem yesterday, and I had to resolve that situation, and then only I was able to create the FTD HA. So I'll just take you to my setup. So I've just shown you some time back. So you can go on to the devices section on the FMC, device management, and then click on. So first of all, we had these 2 devices registered separately to the FMC, FTD 5555A and FTD 5555B. Then we clicked on add HA availability. Once we do that, we'll get certain pop-ups. We have to fill in that. So that pop-up is asking for the failover config. So we also call that as a failover bootstrap config. This is similar to the configuration on the ASA that we do, failover LAN unit primary, failover LAN interface IP, this failover state link IP, that, and all that. So let's go back to the PPT. I'll show you the steps, and then so yeah, so these are the steps you follow. Go to devices, device management, add HA. Once you do add HA, you will get a pop-up to identify which device you want to use as primary and which you want to use as secondary. Click on continue. You will get to configure the failover LAN interface and stateful interface. So in this setup, I'm using both the interfaces as the gig00. In my lab, it is gig03. So yeah, there's an option to use a key. You can have a custom key or an auto key. In auto key, the FMC itself will generate a key for you and use it on both the devices. And for the custom key, you can configure a key. So what is happening here is, so when you deploy an HA on FTD, what essentially is happening is FMC is first contacting the primary FTD, sending this bootstrap config that we have just configured to the primary first and enable failover. And so there are two stages. Deploys this config to the FMC. Once it is deployed, enables failover on that particular FTD. So and then goes to the second. Since this is the initial part wherein there is no active, the FMC needs to contact both the primary and the secondary individually. So first it contacts the primary, pushes the bootstrap config, enables the failover on the primary, and then goes to the secondary FTD, pushes the config, enables it, and after this the HA will be formed, and on the failover link they will communicate, and one will become active, the other will become standby, and thereon afterwards the other normal policy deployments will just go to the active unit. So I have a video that I have created to show you the creation process of STDHA. So if you can see, I have two separate FTDs, FTD ASA 5545A and 5545B. So I go and click add HA, fill in these details. I choose device type as FirePOWER Threat Defense 5545A and 5545B. Click on yes. Now I get, so this part is called the bootstrap config, and there is one important point to note here, that you can only change the bootstrap config while configuring the HA. Same is the case with ASAs. You cannot change the bootstrap config after the failover is working. So this is one point to be noted. So I'm using a custom key, Cisco 123, Cisco 123, and so you'll get a warning acknowledgement to, it will ask you to configure interface monitoring once you do a bootstrap config. Yeah. After this, I'll skip through, I'll pause the video and skip through when the FTDHA is formed. So in the taskbar, I could see that first the FMC contacted the primary, send the bootstrap config, enable failure on it, and then it contacted the secondary, push the bootstrap config, and enable failover on the secondary. So yeah, you could see that the failover is set up, primary is active, secondary is standby. So yeah, so if you go to the, there's an important point that I wanted to highlight. If you go to the button next to the deploy button, you will go to show history, click on show history, and then you'll be able to see the CLI equivalents of the commands that are pushed to the FTD. So this is the primary FTD. So if you see this command, failover LAN unit primary, failover LAN interface gig03, failover interface IP, failover enable. So all these commands is similar to what we do. These are the CLI equivalents. So this is an important place where you could see what exactly is being pushed to the device. So it is under next to the deployment, under deployment, show history, and you can see the transcript. So similarly on the secondary box, there's one important point that we can see what exactly is being pushed to the FPD with the help of the transcripts. So yeah, so this is what how we can create an HA. Now moving to the next part. So yeah, so I've spoken about this. So now let's next part is configuring the FTDHA. So I'll just talk about this using my FMC. So let's go to devices, device management, and then edit DHA. So you can see a high availability tab here. So this first section, high availability configuration, this is entirely the bootstrap configuration. So as I mentioned before, we cannot modify this. This is done during creation. So this is something that is deployed when the HA is set up. Now you can configure data interfaces and standby. So once you have HA deployed, you can come here and configure the data interfaces. So I have configured outside and inside interfaces. You can edit this. So this is the outside interface. Active IP is this, and here is the option to configure a standby IP. So this is the only section, the monitor interface section, from where you can configure a standby IP. There is no other area or part from where you can configure a standby IP. So if you want to configure standby IP, you need to come to device management, HA, and monitor interface section. By default, we will be monitoring all these interfaces, but you can disable monitoring from the same tab. So other point that I wanted to talk about is configuring MAC addresses. So I mentioned the advantages of having virtual MAC addresses, but this is the place from where you can configure. So this is also on the same section under HA. You can add MAC addresses. So you choose any of, so gig 00 is outside. So you can have active MAC address. Let's say I have dead. Similarly, I have dead.deab. So this is the active MAC, the standby MAC. So you have like statically assigned MAC addresses to both interfaces. So now you don't have to worry about any unit failing or replacing any unit. You can keep it here, save it, and deploy it. Just cancel it for now. So there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about from that point. So there are particular timers over here. So I just want to talk about the failover trigger criteria. This criteria involves the failure limit. This is also called as failure threshold, and in ASA terminology, it is called as interface policy. So this says that if there is at least one interface down or in failed state, then I'll do a failover. So that's the failover limit. You can increase it to 2 or 3, but that is not ideally what is done on customer setups. So now we have poll times and hold times. So poll times are something which talks about the frequency of polling. So there is something called as peer poll time. There's something called as interface poll time. So interface poll time are the key alives that are sent across the data interfaces. So outside will send let's say 121.121.121.121 will send keep alive to the standby IP. We can have the standby IP configured from here. So the primary box will send keep alive sourcing from active IP to the standby. Similarly, the standby box will send keep alive from .2 to .1. So it will, so as per configured poll time, we'll send that keep alive every 5 seconds. And if I don't receive any reply or any other keep alive from any of the peer for whole time, which is 25 seconds, then I will declare that interface has failed. So similarly, poll time, peer poll time. So this was interface poll time. Now there is peer poll time. Peer poll time is something just talking about the units. So this is happening over both the failover interface and as well as the data interfaces. So if let's say if a failover link is down, and if I'm not able to um, identify if I'm not receiving any keep alives on the failover interface, the device will start sending keep alives on the data interfaces to see, if the unit is still up. So this is pure poll time and pure hold time. Yeah, so this is all that I am going to talk about on this section. There are certain outputs that are important here. Let's go to statistics. So this is output of show failover on the primary ASA. So this says that primary is active, and these are the synchronizations that has done across the device. Config synchronization, connection table, ARP table, route synchronizations here. So this is similar to show failover output on the ASA. The bottom part of it describes the stateful transactions happening across the unit. You can also go to and see the transactions that are happening on the standby unit. So this is statistics part. We can go to the summary tab. There is an important output there. So it says 5545A active, this standby, licensing enabled, URL filtering, threat, malware, and base licenses. So the important output is the failure history. If you click on this view icon, you'll see. So this is show failure history output from both the units. What it does is it correlates the show failure history from both the FTDs and displays them in chronological order. So you'll see the latest event at the top and thereby go down with the old timestamps. So you can easily correlate what happened when with what box. So as per this, the latest event is 5545B went from bulk sync to standby ready. And yeah, and for 5545A, the latest event is it went from active config applied to active. So this is show failure history output that is being displayed under the summary tab on the FTDs. So yeah, so this was the configuration part. I've talked about this and this and this as well. So let's come to the operations that we can perform on the FTD. So if I go back to my FMC, so if you see there are certain operations that you can perform on the FTDHA. So these options, first is for editing, second is for switching, the third one is for break, and last is for delete. Now I'm going to talk one by one about these actions. So switch. So what does switch actually means? Switching is just same as making the other unit primary or triggering a failover. So we can switch the active peers from the FMC, and that how it is done is actually the FMC sends a no failover active command to the active unit, and then it gives up the active role and the other guy becomes the active. So that is what is happening in the background. So in cases wherein you want to upgrade the firewalls and stuff, then you can switch roles and perform an upgrade. Also in cases wherein the deployment is not going through or certain traffic is not working through a particular device, then you can switch role and see if the other unit is successfully passing that traffic. So that are certain use cases wherein you'd use do a failover and see what is happening. I have a video prepared for the switch as well. Just a moment. So I have primary as standby and secondary is active in this case. So it is asking you, do you want to make the primary as active? So I said okay. So now you can see that the primary has become active, secondary has become standby. So yeah, that's all from this video. So what essentially happens is you just send no failure active command to the active unit, and that triggers the failover. So the next option that is present on the FTDHA is to break the HA. Now, what do you mean by break the HA? Breaking an HA is something like, as of now, I don't want to manage those devices as an HA. I want to individually manage it. So this can be done in situations. So just before starting the presentation, I had a setup wherein both my primary and secondary were active. And I was getting a reason that we cannot detect another peer, cannot detect other peer. I tried many things, and then ultimately what I had to do is I had to break the HA. Once I did the break HA, these were not registered as a part of the HA. They become registered as individual units onto the FTD, and then after that went ahead and created the HA. So breaking an HA is sometimes required in situations wherein we are not able to proceed with certain configuration or an upgrade or something. So we decide to get rid of the HA and just go ahead proceed with the configuration. Yes, it is advised to do it as the last step, if and only if you have exhausted all your options. But yeah, this helps in resolving a lot of problems. So what happens when you do a break HA is that basically you disable failover on the active unit and do a clear configure failover on the active unit, and you also and then on the standby you raise all the config, shut down the interfaces, and it will just have the access policies. So on the primary you will just remove the failover configuration and disable the failover, so it will keep all the interfaces up and it will retain the access policies which it had from the last deployment. So it will keep on processing traffic as it was while it was an active unit, but the standby will have all the interfaces shut down, and it will not have any failure policy or anything like that, and all the interfaces will be shut down, and most of the config will be factory default apart from the ACP. It will keep the ACP access policies as it is. So this makes sure that even if you break the HA, the old primary keeps on passing your network traffic as a standalone unit. So that is what happens in the break part in the background. Let's go to the break video. So I have primary active and secondary standby on this setup. So I'm going to click on the break icon next to switch pair active. So it tells me breaking the HA will erase all the configuration except the ACP on the standby. So that's what I've mentioned, that it will remove everything and just keep the ACP on the standby. You see that after the break, though devices come up as individual FTDs on to the FTD. Now we will see what config was deployed to the units. So let's go to the primary first. So you'll see that, let me pause it here. So you'll see no failover and clear configure failover. So this configuration is pushed to the primary and the secondary, and also all the interfaces are shut down to the secondary. Wow. So this CLI view can be seen from the transcript part. So once this is done, units will be managed as separate units on the FTD HA, on the FMC, and they will not be part of an HA. So what essentially we are doing in break is just disabling failover and doing a clear configure failover on the active, and apart from this, shutting down all the interfaces and retaining the ACP on the secondary standby. So that was break video. Now, yeah, so when you try to break an HA, let me show you that. So it will ask you to do a force break. So there will be a situation wherein the break action itself will fail. Why will it fail? There will be certain scenarios wherein the communication between the secondary box, the standby box, and the FMC is not alright. So it will not receive all this information, and the break action will fail. So there is an option to do a force break. So what it will do is that on the from the FMC's perspective, they will not be in HA anymore, even if it is not able to communicate with the standby peer. So FMC will display two devices as separately registered boxes instead of them showing in the HA. If we don't do this, the the breaking will fail, and yeah, so there is an option to do a force break. Uh, what happens, let's say if we have a standby unit which is not able to communicate with the FMC. So when I do a force break, it will not receive the clear configure failover command from the FMC. So what essentially is happening is the primary unit will not have any failover config, and it will start working as standalone, and the secondary unit will have the failover config. So let's say now it is able to communicate with the FMC back, but so it knows now that it was standby, so it will not pass any traffic. So let's say in this state, for some reason the standby box reloads. Now when it reloads, it comes up and sees that there is no other box in the failover. So what it's going to believe that, okay, the failover is broken and there is no other box in the failover, so I'll assume active role. Now in this situation, you have the old primary running as standalone using the active IP addresses as its IP addresses, and the standby which reloaded and came back up as the active. So there is a possibility of having IP conflict and all that in this breaks scenario. So it is better to, as soon as you have access to the box, just shut down the interfaces and stuff. That was one problem when you can encounter when you do a break HA. So yeah, so I've spoke about all these points that are there on the PPT. Yeah, I've also spoken about this. If user did not do a force break, then what can happen on the FMC, the IP conflict part and the standalone part. So all these points are covered. So worst case scenario. So let's say breaking the HA is not resolving your problem, and you want to go ahead with certain configuration. The break is not happening despite of doing force break as well. So what would you do as a last resort? We have an option to delete an HA. So when you delete an HA, so what it does is it will actually delete the HA, and also there will be no devices registered to the box, to the FMC. So you'll have to re-register it to the FMC, to another FMC, or to the same FMC again and try to make an HA. So also when you do this FMC, so the failover is broken with from the FMC perspective, but when you go and check it on the CLI on the FTDs, you will see that primary is active and secondary is standby and all that. So deleting an HA should be the last resort, wherein you cannot proceed or do anything, and you have a certain deployment that you want urgently to go through and stuff. So deleting is one such option at that point of time. One point to remember is that when you delete a particular FTD registered to an FMC, you will lose interface configuration, you will lose routing. So deleting a device is really risky because we have to configure interfaces and routing requirements manually. The only thing that is retained on the FMC is the policy. Unlike in SourceFire modules, wherein the routing and interface parts was handled by ASA, and policies were stored on FMC. So yeah, deleting should be the last resort, and should totally depend on the criticality of the issue. So I don't have any video for talking about the delete part, so I could just do a delete from here, but that would delete everything from FMC. So I'm not going to do that for now. Next, let's move on to, there are certain CLI commands that you have for your FTD. So first is show high availability config. This will show you something similar to show failover. It will talk about which is primary, which is secondary, what are the statistics across it, all that. So first of all, this arrow that you see, so this arrow is nothing but the cliché of an FMC. So let me just show you. So this is the clish. So when you log into the FTD, you are given a prompt which is with an arrow. This is called as the clish, and you can run all the commands from here. So from, I think from 6.1 onwards, you can run all the commands from here. So you can do show high availability config. So it will show you this is something similar to the show failure output on the ASA. It talks about which is primary, which is active, what are the serial numbers of the devices, what is the versions. It will talk about interface states. So I have inside interface shutdown, I have outside interface waiting, the disk status is fine, the snot version is fine. So these are the things which are monitored across the failover. And these are the statistics that I was talking about that we saw under the high availability tab. The routes synced and stuff, the command synchronize and stuff. So this is shown under show high availability config. The next command that CLI that we're talking about is configuring high availability disable. So this is similar to what we do from the FMC with the break. So we can break disable failover using the break options from the FMC, or we can do it from the CLI. So when the device is not registered into FMC and you want to break, so let's say for example you deleted the HA from the FMC, but deleting the HA from the FMC does not ensure the failover is still up on the FTDs. So you can go ahead and do configure high availability disable. So this will remove the failover config from both the boxes and make it standalones. So yeah, so there are certain use cases where it is mentioned that let's say you're not the FMC that was being used has gone bad. So let's say you are using a hardware FMC to manage the FTD HA pair. For some reason that FMC is not booting up, so you want to add this HA pair to another FMC. So you cannot add, so there is no functionality to add an HA pair to an FMC. You need to individually register those boxes and then only you can add it to make an HA on the FMC. So the first requirement is to disable the HA. So that you can do using configure high availability disable, and then once they are disabled, register those boxes individually to the FMC and then make an HA there. One point to mention here is that you have, when you register the boxes on the FMC, you have to do the interface and the routing configuration. We have to do it by ourselves because we don't have an option to discover FMC FTD's configuration from the FMC. So that's something which is yet not supported. Yeah. So we need to be cautious when we delete the HA or when we disable failover and re-register to a new FMC. So similar to disabling failover on the ASA, we have under the ASA, when we go to the configuration terminal and do a no failover, it's so if we do that on the active unit, it makes the current active unit as disabled, like there is no failover, and on the standby unit it will be in pseudo standby state. So similar to that, we have configure high availability suspend. So this is used in cases wherein you don't want a failover to happen, or if you want to troubleshoot a particular thing on a particular unit, you want to keep that unit running despite of any other events. Let's say something is going on with an interface on an FTD and it's going down because of some issue, and you want to continue troubleshooting with that unit as active, so you could just do configure high availability suspend. So this unit will remain active, the standby will go into pseudo standby, and there will be no failover. So this is used in those situations wherein you want to troubleshoot or pause failover for some reason or disable failover. Another command is so when you do a suspend, how do you re-enable the failover? So to enable the failover, you can use configure high availability resume. So this will make the active again and put the pseudo standby state on the secondary and make it standby again. So that's the CLI command to resume the failover. Now talking about the upgrade of the FTD HA pair. So when we upgrade the HA pair, so we cannot individually upgrade both the FTDs. From the FMC perspective, it is an FTD HA pair, and it is an FMC's job to do a hitless upgrade. So it will serially upgrade one unit after the other. So it will first choose the current standby, send the file to the current standby, it will upgrade the standby, when that standby comes up after the after the upgrade, it will try to become the active, and once so if that becomes active, the new standby will be given a file and then reloaded to come up with the new image. Now, in case when the standby is upgraded and it is waiting to gain the active role from the other unit, if the role swap doesn't happen in 15 minutes, then the upgrade will fail. So there is one condition when the upgrade will fail. So case wherein the standby itself is for example, when I push an upgrade and the upgrade fails on the standby itself, then we will not proceed further. The FMC will declare that upgrade has failed, and we need to retry doing that. So in such conditions, when you want, so this is also an application. I mean, you can also use the break functionality here, wherein you want to get the devices upgraded, and because of an HA, you are not able to do so. So you can break the HA, upgrade the devices, and then re-add them to the HA. So this is one example of using the break statement. Yeah, so it serially does it. It upgrades the standby first, reloads it, makes it active, then upgrades the new standby, and then yeah, you'll have an HA pair upgraded. So now there are certain, so how does policy deployment work for an FTDHA? How is it different than standalone device? So before beginning everything, I just want to point out something, that for an FTDHA, there needs to be at least one active unit if the deployment has to be successful. So for the deployment to be successful, there has to be at least one active unit amongst them. So you can have active failed, and still the deployment will go through. The exceptions are that you cannot have active or active standalone. By active standalone, I mean there is just one unit in this failover, so those deployments will not go through, and active also it will not go through. Apart from this, every situation the deployment will go through. So let's say you have one unit in active, other in cold standby, or another in app sync. So in this cases, the basic thumb rule, the condition is to have at least one unit active for the deployment to go through. Now, in order to understand how the policies are deployed to the FTDHA, we need to understand few processes that are being involved. So there is a process called NGFW manager, which is responsible for communication with the FMC and also for communication for the HA operations in the FTD. So these process has two child processes called as configuration manager CCM and configuration dispatcher CD. So configuration manager talks with the FMC, gets the policy bundle, gives it to the CD. Now it is the CD's job to separate the snot part of the configuration and the Lena part of the configuration and give it to the snot and the Lena, and hence the CD orchestrates the policy deployment. So now there are differences in the deployment. I've spoken about the bootstrapping configuration for failover. So that bootstrapping is the failover config that is being sent across to both the devices. So since at that point of time, during the creation, we don't have any of the unit as active or standby, we need to send those policies to both the devices, the bootstrap config. But now we are going to talk about the normal deployment, wherein one is active, other is standby. So FMC will send the policy DB to the active unit. The CCM will accept the file. Now this file will be sent across to the standby unit. Now this policies will be applied on the active first. Once this is successful on the active, so this snot side config will be applied on the active first, and if the snot side policies are applied successfully on the active unit, we will send that, we will signal the standby to apply the snot part of the config. So once both the snots are upgraded, then we'll signal the Lenas to apply the config together on both the FTD. So for what happens is, first snot on the active is updated, then snot on the standby is updated. Now once this snot is upgrade is successful, we'll update the Lena configs on both the sides simultaneously, because similar to ASA, this is Lena sync, CLI sync happening. So yeah, so the Lena update happens together, whereas the snot happens first on active and then on the standby. So that's the key point to remember. Yeah. So now example wherein the standby policy, so if let's say if the snot on the standby is down, so if the snot on the standby is down, we have first, before this, I've applied config on the active snot, but then we'll have to roll back this config since the snot uh, on the standby is down. Also, if the Lena config is not applying, if it is failing, then also we have to roll back all the configuration. So these are the few failures, rollback scenarios wherein the policy deploy fails and we completely roll back the configuration. So basically, if there is failure on any part, like application on the snot on the active, or application of the snot on the standby, or on the Lena failures on both, then we will completely roll back the configuration. So that's the key point. So let's move to the troubleshooting section of monitoring commands that we have. Few of the commands for the monitoring of the FTDHA. So this is show failover state. This is similar to show failover state on the ASA failover. It will talk about the current state of both the units, and it will also tell the reason for last failure. So it gives you an idea as to what was the last change and why that happened. Next command is show failure history. This is also similar to what is shown on the ASA. It shows the transitions from state A to state B and the reason for them. So this is required in cases wherein people come up asking for root causes for the reason of failover. So we could just compare these outputs on both the devices and correlate the facts to understand the issue better. So this is one important output. So then the other output is the show failover output. This is like the mother of all output because it will have all and each and everything enlisted in it: the serial numbers, the status, the interface status, how is the interface monitoring normal or is waiting or it is failed. So all those things will be shown under show failover. It also have the snot and the disk status along with the update statistics of the stateful failover link. One important command that is available from the CLISH is the capture command. So this is similar to the capture command on the ASA, wherein you could capture keep alive on the interfaces to understand the reasons for monitoring failing. These packets are protocol 105, similar to HA protocol on the ASA. So capture command can be used in various situations. Let's say a customer comes up asking one of the interfaces is monitoring is constantly failing. I need to understand why. So the best thing to do is just take a capture on it, understand to see if you are receiving keep alive for that time when the failure is happening. If you are receiving, then why are you failing over? All those questions can be answered using the captured commands. So now there are certain log files that we here in TAC check when there is an issue along on the FTDHA. So there are two important files that I would like to talk about. First is process_stdout.log and process_stderr.log. So these two logs have the stages, the transition stages, the FSM. By FSM I mean the finite state machine logs. So the device transitions from active config applied to active, from standby to active, from app sync to cold standby, or app sync to active. So all these transitions are mentioned and described in these logs. So if you have any issue related to a device being particularly stuck on a particular state, then we can go into this logs and try to understand what exactly is happening. This is under CD wire log. This log file is present under wire log. Another file that is important is ngfw manager log. So this file talks about the various stages of the policy deployment happening on the FTD. So as I've mentioned before, ngfw manager process comprises of two parts: CCM and CD. CCM deals with the communication with the FMC, and CD deals with applying policies on the snot and the Lena. So but ngfw firewall talks about both CCM and CD policy apply. So this includes getting the policy from the FMC, initiating the policy deploy of the policy DB, application of the snot config, and application of the Lena config. So all of this will be described in ngfw manager log. So anything related to policy deploy or any HA functionality, you can just look into this logs to identify what exactly is happening. So these two log files are very important. Now so the main orchestrator in HA is the CD, config dispatcher. So config dispatcher receives a lot of events from Lena of the local unit and the remote unit. So so every time it receives an event, it writes that to a file. and that file is stored under ngfw where Cisco ngfw manager store HA state. So this HA state is the state of the unit, the failover state of the unit, which is polled by the FMC to display primary, active, and secondary standby onto the GUI. So this is an important location. So if FMC is showing some, so let's say if you do show failover status on the firewall and you see secondary is active, but on the primary on the FMC you are seeing a secondary standby, there is a mismatch, right? So you can just come here and see the file. What is this file talking about? If it is wrong or right. So mostly FMC picks the output from here. If there is a problem with if FMC declaring a wrong state, as a workaround, we have like seen that, deleting that file and adding it resolves these issues. So now the next step, if you look into all this logs and still not able to figure out what the problem is, the next step is to contact TAC. You could generate the troubleshoot file. For generating troubleshoot file, you need to go to System, Health, Monitor. Click. So this window is the drop down. Once you click on that, you will receive the devices with normal status. Click on the appliance and you get the next screen to generate troubleshoot. Click on the generate troubleshooting files, generate the troubleshoot, and once this task is queued and completed, you will see it under the FMC task manager, and you can retrieve this file and upload this to the case and wait for tax response. So that is all from my end under FTDHA. I hope if you understood most of the points that were covered. I will now invite Srinzi to take over and continue with the firepower management HA feature.
Hello everyone, this is Srinidhi Narasimhan from Cisco TAC, and today we'll be discussing the Firepower Management Center high availability. To give you a brief introduction about myself, I've been working with Cisco for the past 2 years. As a TAC engineer, we primarily deal with the Firepower, NG-IPS, and ASA, AMP, and ThreadGrid appliances. So today we'll be concentrating on the Firepower Management Center high availability. So the main agenda or focus for today is going to be on configuration and maintenance and troubleshooting practices that are advised if you have an FMC HA set up in your network. So I'll let you read the agenda for a couple of minutes, then we'll move on to the next slide. Alright, so before we start, let's understand why we need the FMC HA. The purpose of a high availability is to allow us to have two devices which can maintain both your event data and the configuration information, and in case one of the devices fail, the network monitoring can go on uninterrupted by using the other device. So let's understand how the FMC HA basically evolved. During inception 5.3 and 5.4, there were a lot of issues with the HA, and the developers decided to change the databases and make this process much more effective. And on 610 and above, FMC HA got a facelift and came back up new. So which means that between the versions 5.4 and 610, which are 60 and 60X series, FMC HA option was not available. In case you have an HA in 5.4X and you're looking to move the HA to the later versions, what we would advise is to break HA on 5.4X, upgrade all the way to 610, and then set up the HA again on 610. Before setting up the HA, there are three main things that we need to check. The first is the hardware. FMC is not supported on virtual environment, so the hardware on both FMC devices which are intended to be put in HA must be identical. The software versions must also be the same. When I talk about software, the major, minor and the maintenance releases should be the same. And also, as a best practice, we should ensure that the VDB SRU versions match on both ends. This is to avoid issues with configuration sync and a lot of other interruptions that might be caused if it's not ensured. And post this, we also need to make sure that the valid licenses are purchased and they are added to the correct device. So while talking about licensing, there can be two different mechanisms or methodologies that can be followed. One is the classic licenses and the next one is the smart license. So while using smart licenses on 5.4 series, we would have added the separate individual licenses for all the devices on both the active and the standby FMC before proceeding to set up the HA. Otherwise, this causes problems during synchronization. However, on the 610 series and above, the licenses need to be installed only on the primary FMC, and this will be replicated onto the secondary FMC during the HA synchronization process. Moving on to smart licenses, at any point of time, there is only one FMC which contacts the smart licensing satellite, as in the UUID of the active unit is tied to the smart license satellite, which means that where I'm switching over to the standby unit, the other FMC would contact the smart licensing satellite and get the licenses for all the devices. For the purpose of simplicity and as well as to avoid a lot of confusions, we are going to be discussing HA features only on FMC 610 above. There might be a small mention or comparison to 5.4X, but we are going to be dealing primarily only with 6.1X above. The next thing that we would have to keep in mind is the registration of the devices. So what are the best practices that need to be followed when we are setting up the FMC HA would be that remove any devices that were, if they are registered to the secondary FMC, these need to be deleted from the UI because this would cause problem during the setup, as well as these devices need to be moved over to the primary FMC. Apart from this, any configuration that is present on the secondary FMC will be wiped out. So import or export any policy that you would like to retain or any configuration that you would like to retain, move it over to the primary FMC before setting up the HA. And like I mentioned, if this is a new setup, register all the devices only to the primary or the active FMC. Then post the HA setup, if you're having issues with the NAT translation, or if you have NAT in between the devices and the FMCs and you're facing some issues due to this, there is an option to assign a different NAT IP address on the HA standby page. So in case of any issues with the registration failure, it is advisable to remove the device from the FMC, primary FMC, and try registration again to the primary FMC so that this process is initiated again. So the one major requirement to set up or register any devices to the FMC is that port 8305 is where is the port that is used for communication between the primary FMC and the secondary FMC, as well as the sensors. Or sensors are nothing but your NGIPS or your FTD devices, or it can be any device which is capable of being managed by the FMC. So now there needs to be port 8305 open on all ends, so that the communication channel can be set up accurately. To tell you a little bit more about SF tunnel, this is nothing but a secure tunnel which is established through which all file transfer, configuration transfer, event transfer, these all are passed through the SF tunnel. So this is something that is very important for setting up the HA. Alright, so just a brief overview of this process that we spoke about. On the active FMC, we add the device. We provide the details for the device, and then you start the registration. So the active FMC will then initiate a discovery process, and once the device is successfully discovered, the active FMC or the defense center asks the standby FMC to add itself as an additional manager on the device. Now during the next synchronization cycle, the standby FMC would then ask for a registration to the sensor, and after this the sensor will be successfully registered on both the active and the standby unit. So once this is successful, events are sent out continuously to both the primary and the secondary sensors. What are the issues that can be reported during the registration? There are two error states that it can transition to. One is a local miss or a remote miss. Local miss is pending registrations or devices that fail to register on myself or the FMC, and the remote miss would be on the remote FMC if the devices are pending registration or not getting added. So these are the two errors that can happen. These are mostly due to port 8305 not being open, or some communication issue between the either one of the FMCs. So this could be the primary reason for why registration could fail to one of the devices. Great. So moving on to discussing what are the main roles or main terminologies that we will be using throughout the presentation. We have the roles, which are defined as the primary and the secondary. The thing to keep in mind is that the primary is where all the configuration is maintained. So during the setup of the FMC HA, if you elect one of the devices as a primary device, this is where all the configuration and the device needs to be registered to. The secondary will have all data wiped out, and this is something that we should really be careful while setting up the FMC HA. Apart from that, there are active and standby status. So the primary will be the first active device, and there is an option to change the roles to active or standby, and based on the role, the FMC, if in case the primary fails, then you can promote the secondary to the active unit. So these are the terminologies that we'll be using most commonly on the throughout the slide. Moving on to event processing. So we have spoken about configuration, so let's talk about eventing, which is the next most important thing that the FMC is used for. So there needs to be separate management IP addresses on both the FMCs, and these will not be exchanged or swapped during the HA process. Like Ashraf would have mentioned on the FTD HA, this is quite different. But there is only one active, and at any given time, unless there is an issue, the other unit will always be in standby. Since they have two separate management IP addresses, we need to make sure that all the communications that need to be permitted out of the FMC's management interface are replicated on both ends. By this I mean allow access on the firewalls to AMP and malware clouds for disposition checks, for file upload to ThreatGrip for analysis, as well as for the URL category download to Bright Cloud database, SI reputation download. So for all these databases download, we need to permit specific access to both the management IP addresses. Let's talk about how URL category would work. So we need to manually download, ensure that the databases are downloaded and up to date on both the active and the secondary FMC. So since the transition from active to standby is not automatic and this has to be manually done during the time of a failure, ensure that the secondary is active. Only then would it start communicating to the cloud to get all the disposition and the information that is needed. The next main important thing is that if you have user-based policy set up and you're learning the user information from some identity source like user agent, ICE, TS agent or captive portal, they would temporarily fail and the reporters and the users will be reported as unknown until the time the failover becomes healthy, as in leaves the degraded state and the secondary is promoted to active, and then it will start discovering the identity information again, and then the user-based policies would start working. Coming to configuration management, like I mentioned, the FMC would enter a degraded state in case of a failure, and the standby FMC has to be manually promoted, and only then will the HA leave the degraded state. So what are the configurations that are synced between the HA devices during the time of setting up of a failover or regular configuration sync process? I've listed the configuration that would be sent over. The only thing that I would probably check is if there are any custom remediation modules that are present only on the active FMC, make sure that the primary FMC's remediation module are also configured on the secondary FMC to ensure a continuous working of the remediation module. Great. So let's move on to discuss the architecture. So like mentioned earlier, the sensors are the devices which are continuously sending out events to both the active and the standby FMC. Now the event data is stored in MySQL database on our end, and there are some other non-configuration related data that might be present on MySQL databases as well. So during the setup of the HA, there are two processes that happen within the SF tunnel. One is the transaction framework, wherein any data apart from the config like licenses or any files that you need to transfer will be sent via the transaction framework, and this is unidirectional from the active to the standby FMC. The same way, there is a configuration database on the FMC which is called as Sybase. Now these two communicate, the Sybase on the active FMC and the Sybase on the standby FMC communicate through Sybase mirroring, through which the configuration data is passed on from the active to the secondary FMC. To make sure that there are the non-config data which might be needed to be sent over to the standby FMC, there is a process called symmetric TS which converts the non-configuration related data to Sybase databases as well, so that this can also be passed through the Sybase mirroring process. So like just reiterating this again, there are three synchronization mechanisms. One is the Sybase mirroring and the transaction framework, which are in between the two FMCs, and there's something called symmetric DS which is running inside to convert the non-config related MySQL database to Sybase. Alright, so let's move on to check what would be considered as healthy on the HA. When I have an HA set up, what are the processes that on the background should be running? Let me stop sharing and take you back to the devices that I have set up in HA. So if we take a look at this, let me run through the processes again. The first main important process is SF tunnel. Make sure that the SF tunnel is running without any issues and that the SF tunnel is successfully set up. The second process that we will be checking to see if it's running properly is SFIP proxy. This is a very important process again because a lot of data is passed to SF tunnel via SFIP proxy. This is responsible for opening up the ports internally, which are responsible for this transfer to take place, as well as there are two other processes that I would check is Sybase. So the Sybase would be waiting state on the standby FMC, and it would be on the active state on the primary FMC. This would also be this would also not be present, as in it will not be running on a standalone FMC device. So this would run only on the active FMC of the HA. So the last process that I would be checking is symmetric. So the symmetric DS, like we mentioned, is the engine that is responsible for converting a few non-configurated data to the Sybase so that it can be passed over the HLA. So now this should be running. You will see this process running even on a standalone FMC. So these are the processes that I would check, and the same we can check on the active FMC as well to make sure that the HA is healthy. These are the general processes that I will be checking. And like I mentioned, the Sybase arbiter, the process would be running on the active FMC. So this would be a good way to identify which is the active FMC by looking at the CLI. Alright, so moving on to the processes, we have discussed what are the important processes that are required for the synchronization. Next, let's move on to discuss how the HA establishment happens, or what is the flow that happens in the backend when the FMC HA is set up. So the first thing is there is SF tunnel is again the process which is responsible for ensuring continuous transfer of data, and internal tunnels are all set up on top of the SF tunnel. So once this is set up successfully, the transaction is initiated to copy files, licenses, and all other information are transferred. Once this complete, the Sybase mirroring related changes are done, which is nothing but the configuration. So all these are passed over the SF tunnel as well. Once this is complete, a periodic sync is ensured between the two FMCs. So there's something called a synchronization daemon, or sync-D, which is responsible for periodic file replication, and this is also something that is responsible for hearing hello or exchange of HA health messages between the FMC HAs. Alright, moving on to the part of setting up the FMC HA. There are 8 steps that are involved in this. Let me take you to my lab device where I have an active FMC setup so that we can discuss this. Alright, so this is a FMC in HA that I've already set up. Now, where I would check the HA information is under System Integration High Availability. This is where the status and of the HA is maintained, and any operations that you would like to do is done from here. What are the prerequisites? Like I mentioned, let's walk through quickly through the checks that we would do before setting up the HA. The first thing is we would navigate to Help About section and check whether the hardware, the software version, the SRU and the VDB are same on both ends, and then we will select a designated primary unit. Now on the primary FMC, make sure that all the devices are registered only to this, and on the secondary, if in case any devices are already registered, remove them from the secondary, export all configuration. So we do this by the option System Tools. There is Import and Export, wherein you can take all the policies out of the FMC and Alright, sorry about the pause. So let's move on the FMC. On the FMC, we would be registering the devices to the active FMC, and we'll make sure that all the devices are removed from the secondary FMC, as well as the configuration is exported out of the secondary FMC and added to the primary FMC. Now once all this is ensured, we can navigate to System and Integration and make sure that we set up the primary device as with the role of primary FMC and the other one with the secondary FMC. And during the registration process, we would also be asked, prompted for certain information. This I will show you on a FMC that I already have, which is not a part of a HA. Great. So under high availability option, we would be seeing this FMC currently with a standalone status. And in case you want to put this as the primary FMC, we would be displaying this information here. Alright, so currently it's a standalone, as in no high availability is present. So the minute you click primary, it requests you for the secondary FMC host IP address, the registration key, and a NAT ID. So the NAT ID is nothing but a key that needs to match on both the primary and the secondary FMCs. This is applicable in case there is a NAT or a firewall in between the two FMCs that are intended to be set up in HA, and we need to make sure that the NAT ID is the same on both the primary and the secondary FMC. So yeah. Great. So let's quickly skip these parts. We have already discussed it. So on the high availability in secondary, we recommend that the high availability first be set up on the secondary unit and then move on to configuring the primary. So on the secondary, provide the IP address of the FMC and the registration key, and then move on to set up the same on the primary FMC as well, and click on register. So once this is done, there would be a prompt warning display asking whether you really want to set up HA. We'll proceed to select yes, and during this process it is completely expected to see a lot of messages pop up on the task manager as well as the system UI mentioning that the certain processes exited or certain processes are being refreshed. This is quite completely normal during the initial stages of the FMC HA setup. Another thing to remember is that how long, the most commonly asked question here is how long does it take for the FMC HA setup to be established? Now this really depends on the databases, because like we said, there is the event and the configuration database. So what we do is set up the I believe there's someone requesting to share from step one. Let me take you back to that, and so that we can see from step one what are the things that need to be implemented. So yeah. Alright, so on the step one, we check that this is a snapshot of the help about page. Note that, like I mentioned earlier, this FMC HA setup is not possible on virtual machines. It's only possible on hardware. This is just for a snapshot. So make sure that the software versions are same, and then once this has been confirmed, let's move on to setting up the HA, which is under System, Integration, High Availability, which as I showed on the UI. So configure the high availability first on the secondary, select the role as secondary, input the primary host and the registration key and NAT ID if applicable, and then let's move on to setting up the primary FMC. So we would navigate to the UI. So this is nothing but a snapshot showing that the registration of the high availability was set up successfully on the secondary. Now we move on to setting up the high availability on the primary. We will navigate to System, Integration, move on to High Availability tab on the primary FMC, select the role of this FMC as primary, and then select the secondary host IP address here and the registration key, NAT ID if required, and then go ahead and click on register. So once this is done, there will be a prompt asking you whether if you want to proceed with this, click on yes, and then there will be a lot of tasks displayed on the health as well as the FMC GUI, and the FMC status will be degraded until the complete setup is done. This is to be expected. And coming back to what I was originally talking about, there should be a good bandwidth between the FMCs for the configuration sync to happen really quickly, and depending on the database size, it might take how much ever time it might require to transfer all the configuration files during the initial setup. Apart from that, the devices also, the FMC would also start sending out registration requests to the devices, the secondary FMC, and the registration between the devices would also happen during this time. So once we have set up everything, and we would like to verify that the HA has been set up successfully, we would navigate to High Availability tab and check whether the summary, under the summary, the status and the synchronization have a green tick mark. This is expected output that we can see on both the primary and the secondary FMC. Moving on to discussing about the actions that you can perform on the FMC HA. The first one is switch peer roles. Let me take you back to the lab device so that we can take a quick look at where this option is available and what happens when we do this. So when you click on switch peer roles, it would prompt you asking to whether you want to continue performing this. I would go ahead and select yes, and this would initiate a lot of things on the background. So one more thing that we can take a look at while this is happening is that if you see there's no deployment option here, this is the standby, the FMC that I elected as a standby. So there is no option to deploy and make any configuration changes that you would like to hear. So this page will display only information regarding the HA as well as a few other licensing and device related information. Alright, so once I select yes to the prompt, you will see a lot of messages appearing on the task on both the FMCs. So let's wait for the synchronization time to expire, after which during the next sync this is going to be communicated over to the secondary the standby FMC as well, and you will start seeing a role change reflected on both. Alright, so you see the prompts that you see here are quite normal. It's advisable to have advised to have some patience while switching roles or breaking HA or setting up HA. And like I said, it really depends on the database size and the operations that run in the background. So TAC cannot have a good estimate on how long this process or each of these processes will take. So I have done a previous switch roles, and you can see that once it's done, it would give you a green status saying that the FMC switch role was successfully completed. So this is what we are waiting to see, and this might take time, so we'll come back to it later. Moving on to the next tab, that next option that you have on your HA page is the break HA option. So while clicking on the break HA, again there is a warning displayed requesting to check whether you want to proceed with this. So I would say yes to this if I really want to break the HA, and then move on to selecting what happens to my devices. So at a point of wherein a successful HA is established, there is active SF tunnel communication between the devices and the primary FMC, as well as the devices and the secondary FMC. Now through this channel, events are continuously sent out. So during the time of deregistration or the breaking up of the HA, we need to decide what happens to the devices that are connected to both the HA units. So there are three options here. One is that from the unit in which you are breaking the HA, you can choose to manage devices on that console, or you can choose to manage the devices on the remote console, or you can stop managing the devices on both using both FMCs. So these are the three options. So depending on what we select, the devices will be deregistered from that corresponding FMC or will be deregistered from both the FMCs. Moving on to the next feature, which is called as pause synchronization. So this is self-explanatory. The name indicates that it's going to pause the synchronization between the primary and the secondary FMC. So during the pause synchronization, the point to keep in mind is that if we are pausing the synchronization on the primary FMC, resume can be done on both the primary and the secondary FMC. However, while pausing the synchronization on the secondary unit, the resume can be done only for the secondary from the secondary FMC. So this is something to keep in mind and not worry about in case you run into the issue scenario wherein the synchronization is paused from the secondary, but I'm not able to resume the synchronization from the primary. This is expected behavior. Before we move on to the troubleshooting, let's go back and see if the sync was successful, and let's look at what happened on the UI. So the switch role was successful. However, the databases are being switched, and this is what is current. This process might take a little long as well. So on a previous transaction, you can see that the database switch roles were successful as well, and I promoted this unit from standby to active. So the primary and the secondary roles will not swap during the switch role action. At any point of time, I would not be able to see any specific action indicating that the primary and the secondary is going to be switched over as well. Great. So the next feature that we talked about was pause synchronization. I'll wait for the HA to be healthy before proceeding to do this. Moving on to discuss troubleshooting, or what are the things that we will look at when an FMC HA fails, and understand what is the problem. So the first thing that we can follow is the visual inspection. While performing any action like an upgrade or a backup or something specific to a database change on the FMC, the HA status might go to degraded or might show up as failed for specific reasons. So there are cases wherein this is expected or normal, and there are cases wherein this is not the expected behavior. So the first step would be to understanding whether the HA status that we are seeing is something that as a result of an action that was performed recently, or was it done because of a failure on the FMC. So we would look at the health alerts to understand if one of the devices had a power failure, or if one of the devices had some network connectivity issue which might stop it from talking to the other FMC, putting the HA in a degraded state. The next thing that we can check is we saw an output of how the HA should look like if the HA is healthy, as in we saw green tick marks next to the status and the synchronization, whereas here on this snapshot we can see that the status of the HA is degraded and the synchronization is shows up as a warning saying it's failed as well. There could be different reasons behind why the status is displayed. We'll discuss that in a later slide, but a snapshot of this would be really helpful in understanding the reason for why the HA is currently down when you're engaging TAC. Alright, so now that we have moved past the visual inspection, where do I look at logs on the on the Fireside Management Center itself to understand the reason for the failure? So I would start by looking at action queue messages, which indicate state changes on any task that is happening. So that would be displayed on your action queue log. So this is under var log. So we would be looking to see any HA related messages that can give us a reason for why the HA operation failed. moving on, we would also be checking under messages. So the messages would print out anything related to the device itself. So the processes which are running, if they have stopped and for what reason. So we can look at some critical processes that are responsible for the HA and grep for any error messages that you see related to these processes or any failures on these related to the processes, and that would give us a good information of why the failure is occurring. Apart from that, there is symmetric.log, which can help us understand if there was a failure with the symmetric DS, which is the process that is responsible for converting all tables which are non-config related data that are present on the MySQL tables to the Sybase tables. So we can look at some any errors specific to symmetric.log under symmetric.es, and then move on to syncd.log. So the synchronization daemon is what is responsible for transferring files across the SF tunnel. It could be licenses, or it could be any HA related hello packets which are missing. So these can be seen on syncd logs, which are again under var log. And then there is mojo.log. This is related to any UI issue that I'm seeing on the FMC. So I would take a look at mojo.log. Apart from this, there are a lot of other things that TAC engineers can look into to understand what exactly happened during the time of the failure, to ensure that we have enough data to troubleshoot the issue. Right when you notice that there is an actual issue on the FMC HA and you would like to involve TAC to investigate this further, collect troubleshoot files from both the active and the standby FMCs, because there are certain data which are present only on the active FMC or only on the standby FMC, and both the troubleshoots are needed to understand what happened or what went wrong on the UI. So apart from this, let's go back to the CLI so that we can take a look at the processes. So make sure that the PM tool status are all green and healthy during the time that we should be expecting to see running or waiting process according to the process we are checking. Apart from that, if the GUI is down, this is quite common while there is a break in the HA operations, the GUI might go down. The reason for this is because while the UI is displayed, there is a high dependency on the Sybase database as well as the arbiter process, as well as a lot of engines that are closely related to the processes that we are seeing here. So during time of an issue, when the FMC HA is in a degraded state, it could be possible that one or both the UIs are not accessible. So now how do I get out of this scenario wherein I'm not able to access both the UIs? I'm not sure what happened to the FMCs that are in HA. I understand there's a problem, but I would like to understand what are the states that are in. There are two scripts that are available inbuilt on the FMC itself. So the first one is troubleshoot_hadc.pl, and the other one is manage_hadc.pl. To run these scripts, we need to SSH to the FMC and then enter the root prompt, and we should be able to run these two scripts. Keeping it side by side for reference. So on this, I'm already on this FMC, I'm already on the root prompt. So there is a script already available on the FMC itself. This doesn't need to be installed. So once you run this, there are options displayed indicating what are the things that we would like to check. So troubleshoot_hadc.pl is just a troubleshooting utility. So there are not it doesn't generally cause any config change on the backend, so it should be safe to use. So let's take a look at option 1. So it pulls up information on the current status and shows us a lot of information regarding what is this, what are the FMC role, which FMC am I looking at, are the status is healthy, and am I able to is all the databases that are supposed to be up and running, are these healthy on my end. This script can also be run on the secondary or the standby FMC to understand what is the current status. Then we can execute a database ping, which is an attempt to connect to the standby unit and check whether the databases are communicable from both ends. Apart from that, you can check the arbiter status, which is the Sybase arbiter. It shows up as running and healthy in this particular output. And then you can also check the peer connectivity. So right here we would be needing the peer UUID, and so I'm just going to enter now. So we can see that the displayed information stating that this output would make more sense if passed on to the TAC engineer, because these all represent a certain value on the device itself or the peer end, which we expect to see. Alright, so the last would be, let me go back to the script, the option 5, which is to print messages of the action queue. So here again there is a dependency, and it requests for a specific task ID. So if you're looking for, let's say, HADC sync, you can input the specific task ID for this, and then this would proceed to show information related to this. Again, this would be something that that would make more sense to understand what are the error messages that we saw that might have led to the current state that the FMC is on. So if I want to exit the script, I would go ahead and use 0. This is an option to exit the script. The next most important script, we have already run through the options, as in what option 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 stand for. The next script that is inbuilt and present on the FMC is manage_hadc.pl. I would advise caution while using this script, is because there are a lot of changes that can occur to the FMC databases while running this and selecting an incorrect or a non-intended option. So let's Alright, looks like there's some modification of the script on my primary FMC, but so let's move on to discuss what are the things that we would, what are the options that we have while using the manage_hadc.pl. So again, you can choose to show the HA status, and this would display the messages, as well as register this as a secondary or the primary unit on an FMC HA. So this is basically is the UI equivalent script that runs in the background while initiating an action on the FMC HA UI page itself. So a most common option that we would use is pause mirroring. This would pause the transaction between the two FMCs. So my FMC is now healthy and post the role change. Now what I have done is executed a pause mirroring. Let's look at the UI. So now the resume synchronization as option is available only from the standby FMC as we discussed before, because we ran the script to pause the synchronization on the standby FMC. So I can choose to resume the synchronization again, and this would start the sync between the FMC in the active and the secondary units. Okay. While using option 9 or 10, let's be very cautious and not input a number that might cause a break in the HA operations completely, and end up leaving the HA in a much more degraded state than it was initially. So while the troubleshoot_hadc.pl is relatively safe to use, manage_hadc.pl is a script that could be avoided until could be used as a last resort. Moving on to the most common issues that we would observe while looking at the FMC HA in a degraded state. The first one is missing UI. So either of the FMC's UI could show 500 internal error or not load the UI. So the general things that we would check is this is definitely a UI related issue. So there is HTTP_error log, which is present under var log HTTP D, and this would show us information on why the UI is unable to load up. There are some specific error messages that would indicate whether certain permissions are not available, or if a process which is responsible for bringing up the UI is down. So under this we can get more information on what exactly is preventing the HTTP page to load up. Apart from that, the path that I've just mentioned, var sfhtd docs page data YML. So this YAML is a place wherein is really this data is really important to display anything on the UI. So typing in touch command can also result in bringing up the UI. However, while you notice some error related to the UI or not able to understand what those messages could possibly mean, it is always advisable to collect the troubleshoot files and involve TAC, so that the backend processes which are running can be analyzed to understand the issue. And then the next common issue that we would be noticing during a FMC HA operation is that the switch during a switch, one of the FMC shows up as system processes are restarted, and they do not come up at all after the HA switch role. So there are three tasks which occur in the background while this switch role is initiated. The first is that the local FMC has to update its status and reflect the new change in role, and then the other unit has to reflect this change as well. Once these two are done, there is also a Sybase arbiter which is responsible for making sure that all the follow-up tasks are done and that it's reflecting its states to ensure that the currently active and the standby units are reflected. So once this is done, and we can check the var log action queue messages to see any messages related to database switch roles or any errors or failures that we are seeing. And then obviously you can run manage_hadc.pl script that we just discussed, and choose the option 5, I believe, for pause mirroring, and once the mirroring has been paused, it will give us a more the Sybase the mirroring that goes on in the background is this process is there's going to be no dependency on this process, and then we can proceed to investigate as to why the UI is not coming up by looking at these error messages, looking at the processes which are down. So like I showed before, PM tool status and grepping for GUI will give you all the processes that need to be running. Just so that we have it for reference, let me pull this up again. So yeah, option 5 for pause mirroring. So once you've done that, we can check the GUI processes. to understand if that all the processes are healthy and in a good running state, as well as look at the HTTP, the error logs that were mentioned, and look to see if there's any specific error messages that we are seeing in action queue and where log messages that could indicate the problem. Alright, so once the GUI is up, assuming we've identified the problem and one of the error messages that we are seeing, we have identified the reason for why the processes are down, we can take steps or corrective actions to ensure that the UI issue is fixed. And after this is done, we can check for Sybase issues. If the UI is fine, but there are some specific error messages that you're seeing related to Sybase, we can fix that as the next step, and then we can continue to resume mirroring, and this would start the transaction, the synchronization between the two FMCs, and they would resume the healthy status, and we should be able to see both the UIs once this is successfully done. So we've discussed switch roles and UI gone missing due to some reason, and 500 error messages displayed because of some permission issue on the back end. So the next common case scenario that we might run into are database synchronization failures. So there are two different databases on each FMC, and there is a process running to make sure that there's a healthy communication between the MySQL and the Sybase, as well as there is a lot of processes which run responsible for communication between the two FMCs itself. So any one of these could cause issues with database synchronization not happening. So the most common symptoms of the problems that you can see would be the FMC HA page would never show a green tick mark, and even after a resume synchronization is done, and the FMC might show system processes are restarting, like we saw on the UI issue that we discussed before, and HA break failed, and one of the devices did not come up after the break. So these are all side effects or symptoms that you can notice when there are some database synchronization failures happening on the back end. So again, the first place I would check for any issue with related to HA would be the action queue, and I would grep for error message with regards to resume sync, and then check if all the processes are up in PM tool. That would be the next step, and then look for any error specific to Sybase on the process stdout.log as well as the error log, and make sure that there is a proper minimum network bandwidth maintained. We would advise around 5 Mbps at least between the two FMCs to make sure that the network has enough bandwidth to transfer. If in case it's a huge database on both the devices, there are a lot of policies, a lot of events, then it might be recommended to have some a better network bandwidth between them. So this can be a call that can be taken post looking at the normal operations and checking to see how long the initial HA actually took to be set up, and these are some things that can give us information on why the database synchronization could not be working or happening. Apart from this, there are failures that can happen right at the start of the HA establishment. So HA establishment can fail with the following error messages. So one is a message saying that the peer already exists, or on the HA page sync is failed, or degraded, or a warning saying that the peer has fewer devices. So starting from the last one, peer has fewer devices, this indicates either a local or a remote miss. This would ideally be a remote miss. So the other FMC unit does not have the same amount of sensors that are registered triggered on the active or the primary FMC unit. So this might mostly be due to communication. We would check the connectivity, and then if in case there is a NAT ID that is required, we would input those details on the standby FMC and move on to fix this issue by troubleshooting the connectivity. And then if the last resort that can be attempted is to delete those devices from the primary and re-attempt a registration. And during this time, there should be, as long as the HA is in a successful or a healthy status, the FMC should start talking to the sensors again, the secondary FMC, and attempt to re-establish the communication channel. And this would mostly cause the issues to be resolved when it comes to local or remote miss issues. Then moving on to degraded status, when there is a error message with degraded status which is displayed for a really long time, then we would need to investigate the logs mentioned to understand what are the cause, what could be the cause for the synchronization or the to fail. Again, the other status that we can encounter is sync failed. So on the sync failed, there is the synchronization daemon, which is responsible for communication between the two, or the synchronization between the two FMCs. In this process, if there is any specific error, we can look at action queue as well as the syncd logs to understand why the synchronization might have failed. Another error message that we can see is peer already exists, which could be a result of earlier registration of the devices in an FMC HA with a different FMC, or a break which was not successful before the attempt to re-register the FMCs in HA is established. So during this error message wherein you see peer already exists, we can run a couple of scripts on the back end to understand, to collect the UUIDs from both the FMCs and remove the peers from the corresponding databases where this information might be stored, and then proceed to try the registration again. So these are the common issues that we would generally encounter while the FMC HA is in operation, or while during the initial setup. Then moving on to the next major operation that can be performed during a normal working scenario is, let's say we have two FMC devices which are set up in HA, and there is a regular task which is scheduled to back up the devices. So while the FMC devices are HA backup is being done, it is normal to see that the synchronization between the peers is paused. This is to avoid confusions, because when initiating a database backup, and there are some database tasks that are running in the background, this is not really advisable. So this is a mechanism by design. So this should initially pause the synchronization, and this would leave the HAs in a degraded state. So during the time of the backup, it is expected to see degraded HA states on both the active and the standby units. And once the backup is done, the HA should resume back to its normal state. One more thing to note is that during the time of this backup, we can use the active FMC, but the standby FMC would not be available to use during this time. Moving on to the next major challenge, or the question that is in everybody's mind: how do I upgrade devices which are in HA, which are set up in HA? So let's talk about the process first. So what happens is that the initiation of the upgrade on both the units is not automatic. We have to manually put the upgrade files in and start the upgrade process. So what we would advise to do is upload the files on both the units, and pause the mirroring, and on the standby continue upgrading the FMC, and this would leave the HA in a degraded state. As an active unit would still be the active unit, whereas the status would be degraded until the upgrade on the standby is completed. So once the the standby has been completely upgraded, we would see that it comes back up as an active device as well. So both the units now are in active and in a degraded state. Now this scenario that we are seeing, wherein both the FMC HA units are in active, is called as a split brain. This is the terminology that we use to describe this scenario. And then on the active or the degraded FMC, the primary unit, you can continue to upgrade, initiate the upgrade process. So that again would transition to a standby role post the upgrade has been completed, and the mirroring would be resumed. So we can promote one of these devices to active once the upgrade has successfully been completed on both the devices, to continue a normal HA operation, because until both the units show up as active, the HA would still be in a degraded state. So the HA state was initially healthy during the time of the start of the upgrade, would resume to its healthy state only after both the units have been upgraded to the same version and have been promoted to the correct roles. Only then, after a successful mirroring, would we see the status being reflected as healthy. So these were the steps that we discussed. So the upgrades are done in a serial manner. So pause synchronization, and then initiate upgrade on the secondary, the standby unit. And once this is done, initiate upgrade on the primary and promote one of these devices as active. So this would be what we'd be using. The other scenarios on which FMC might enter the split brain condition or become active are when there are HA breaks, or when there is a power outage or some network connectivity issue between the two devices, and this could result in the FMCs becoming active. So we can resolving split brain is very simple. Just need to promote one of these devices as active, and this would be prompted by the system. So what we need to ensure is that if one of those devices never come back up, then there's a problem that needs to be investigated. If they are back again and both in active, it is very simple to promote one of them as standby. This would not make a major impact on the HA, and should be something that is easily fixable. Before we move on to the question and answer, any questions that you might have, let's take a look at the HA devices that we set up again, and so briefly talking about the entire process, I would let's run through a quick demonstration on how the HA would be set up, and where we would look for any issues. So on the UI itself, a healthy health alert with no any task related to high availability successfully completed. This is something that I would normally expect to see. Apart from that, what we discussed was the deploy button will only be available on the primary and not on the secondary device. And also another thing to remember is that while before setting up the HA, ensure that the versions are correct, match on both ends, and that the hardware is same. The next thing we would do is to import or export, use this option to import and export all configuration that you would like to be retained on the secondary FMC. And once this is done, ensure that all devices have been deleted from the device management page. So this is the import export wherein you can select the policies that you would like to be retained and export it out. And the next step is obviously the registration. Make sure that there are no devices initially registered on the standby FMC. So after this, we would also move on to checking whether there are any licenses that might have been left over on the classic management license page. So the thing to remember is that if you have some additional licenses on the standby FMC and the FMC HA setup is done, the classic licenses that are used on the standby FMC would never be used, as in you won't be able to see them in the UI, but you might have issues releasing the licenses for use on another device. So it's always recommended to delete all licenses on the classic and the classic licenses that we have that you have on the device. However, on smart licensing, this process is automatic. It releases any licenses that might have been added to the standby FMC, and these are available back reflecting on your smart account to be used for for other purposes. So this is with regard to licensing. After these checks are done, we can proceed to configuration of the HA, which is under integration, and we would follow the process of setting up the high availability like we discussed. And once we have set up the primary and the remote peer, we would wait for the status and the synchronization to go back to healthy, and this might take time. It depends on the network bandwidth. There is no tentative timeline that can be defined here. And once this is done, we should be able to use any the HA for normal purposes. So events are shared all on real time between the from the devices to both FMCs. In case you're not seeing specific events coming in on the there seems to be some missing events, it might mostly be due to some specific issue with communication from the device to the FMC. So that would be something that we would check. The next thing to ensure is that since there are two separate IP addresses on the management interfaces, ensure that there is continuous connectivity to all external databases that the FMC might need to reach out to ensure a healthy operation. So these are the basic pre-checks on how to set up the high availability and what is the healthy status, and what are the error messages that you could see or would observe during a time of a break in this operation. Okay, so before we wind up, I would like to run through the process of setting up the FMC HA on on a lab device, so that we can watch the live logs. Alright, great. So we have set up the HA. Now the reason for showing this is to look at what are the messages that that occur on the background. So you would see a lot of error messages related to certain processes going down and certain processes coming up. Just to make sure that the HA is set up correctly and that we collect all logs that we might have during the we can run the command pigtail deploy during the time of the registration, and this would show up a lot of information on what exactly is the cause for why the HA was not successfully set up. So this is normal to see a lot of error messages or synchronization failures during the time of the FMC HA setup. So it's advisable that we wait until this is successfully done. So since this process itself is going to take quite a lot of time, we would not be waiting to see the complete results of this, and I would throw the session open for Q&A in case you have any further questions. You can post them on the chat and we'll be happy to answer the same. So this is me, so we'll be signing off today's FMC and FTD HA presentations, and I'm really thankful for everybody who patiently attended the entire session. Thank you.
So guys, we'll have the WebEx open for another 5 minutes. If we have any outstanding questions, you can put it on Q&A, and post that we'll have the session closed. We'll share the presentation material within the next 24 hours, and once you log out of the WebEx session, you would get a survey form to rate the presentation. So do rate and send your feedback. So we'll leave it open for another 5 minutes and then we'll close it up. Thanks for joining.